Okay, welcome everyone to another session of the FLIRT series, the Friday Light Informal Research Talks. My name is Garrett Richards and I'm on the FLIRT committee. And if you are interested in learning more about FLIRT or you want to deliver a FLIRT, please feel free to get in touch with myself or Jennifer Buxton with the Office of Engagement or Daniel Nadolny with the Psychology Department. And if you want to be on our email list, you can also request that and we'll give you specific information each week. I should offer a thank you to the Research and Engagement Office. When we do these in person, they provide the catering, and when we do them online, they provide Jennifer's time and expertise for hosting and live streaming. So I'm going to introduce our speaker in just a second, but just a few things to note before that. If you're joining us through Facebook Live, you can put any questions or comments on the post there, and I'll be monitoring those as the moderator, and I'll relay those to our speaker, so you can ask questions that way. If you are joining us directly in the WebEx meeting, you can put your questions in the chat window there, or you can unmute yourself once we're in the discussion part of the session, and you can ask that. So without any further ado, I'll introduce our speaker for today. It's Ivan Savic, who is a political science instructor with the School of Science and Environment. And I'll let him share his screen and get his slideshow ready to go. But the talk that he's going to be delivering is called Making America Great Again, the Prospects for and Consequences of a Second Trump Term. So an extremely timely topic for us to be talking about today. I'm really excited, really interested to see what Ivan has to say. And I think, Ivan, you can let me know, I know you're going to leave some time for questions at the end, but would you also like to take questions throughout?
Yes, especially if there's something related to a slide or if there's confusion. So yeah, that's fine.
Okay, I'll keep an eye out for that, for the comments on Facebook Live and also comments here. But yeah, I'll hand it over to you. Might take us a minute or so to get the slides up, but hey, that's no different than a regular FLIRT.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just a moment.
Great.
Okay, so
all right, thanks, Ivan. Yeah, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay, so today, so the slides are up.
Yeah, I can see them. They're not in slideshow mode, though.
Okay, let's see. Okay.
That looks great. Okay, thanks.
So as Garrett said, I'm going to be introducing a talk on a rather obscure academic topic, and I'm not sure if there's much interest in the outcome, but we'll see. But basically, I want to look at three questions, right? So first of all, why did Trump win in 2016? Obviously, the big question, who will win in 2020? And what are the consequences going to be for this election? Now, starting first with the 2016 election. So these are the results. And basically, as we all know, this was the outcome was that we had Clinton winning the popular vote by about 3 million votes, or basically 2% more than Trump did, but losing the Electoral College by a significant margin, not as significant as Trump claimed, but still significant. And this is actually, I believe, the fifth time in US history that an electoral college, where the election was decided with the popular vote going for one candidate and the electoral college going for another, right? And more interestingly, this is the second time it's happened in the 21st century. And in both cases, the Republican won despite not getting the popular vote. In terms of the breakdown, now this is actually what the vote looked like. And actually, you can see that there are a few votes that went for other candidates like so we got one electoral vote for Spotted Eagle. I believe, I don't know if, yeah, Sanders got one in Hawaii. This depends on, because different states have different rules. Most of them have whoever wins the states gets all the electoral votes. Another phenomena is what are known as faithless electors, those who are supposed to vote for one candidate but decide to vote for whoever they want. This is why a couple of people in Washington actually voted for Colin Powell instead of Trump. Washington is also one of the states that allows you to split the electoral votes. In terms of demographics, Clinton did primarily well with younger voters, with women, and with minorities and more educated people. Trump did much better with older voters, less educated voters, and men, right? And especially white men. So, what were the causes of Trump's win? This is complicated and it's still being debated. In fact, for a long time, the split was between those who believed that it was due to racism or interference in the election versus those who argued it was about economic unease, right? And I'd argue that actually both played a role. And first of all, we have to remember that this idea of racism and economic factors, they're not separate things, right? And very often, especially in the US, the way that economic downturns and government spending are viewed are very often through this lens, and especially through a more generally polarized lens. And as I'll show in a moment, the US has been getting more politically polarized. This isn't something as unique to American history as a lot of people like to point out. Polarization around party lines is actually, historically quite common. And interestingly enough, even famous cases of outlaws in the Wild West actually sometimes had a political dimension. So the conflict between the Earps and the Cowboys that culminated in the OK Corral actually had a political dimensions, the Earps being Republicans, the Cowboys being primarily Democrats. There's a similar dynamic in terms of the motivation and circumstances of Billy the Kid's activity and his arrest and so on. Two other factors that are also important is one is a general disillusionment in US politics. And this really helped Trump because he was running as an outsider, right? And this ended up appealing to a lot of voters. And we'll look at some of the breakdown in a moment. And then the final element is Hillary and Obama. And Hillary was running as basically the most qualified candidate. And there's, reason to say she actually held a number of posts. She knew the presidency from the inside when she was first lady and so on. But in 2016, when there was a lot of disappointment with the way American politics functions on both the left and the right, these advantages were really disadvantages. And an interesting factor is that a number of Trump voters, especially in the Midwest, white working class voters, many of them voted for Obama, and in some cases voted for Obama twice, but then shifted to Trump. And this is partially explained by the fact that Obama was in many ways a disappointing candidate to a lot of people. The hope was that he was going to change politics. You'd actually have much more economic activity, and also the idea that he would actually be able to heal the racial divide. And for a lot of people, there was a lot of disappointment in basically how well Obama achieved these things. And attaching that to Hillary hurt her. Now, of course, it wasn't just Obama and it wasn't just Hillary, but these were elements that played a role. Now, this is just a rough graphic of the kind of issues that are important. And usually the most important issue is the economy. especially in sort of the lead up to the 2008 election, which McCain was winning up until basically the full impact of the financial crisis hit in about August. And that's when things turned around for Obama. But again, economic considerations did play an important role. And there's some longer term trends in terms of working class voters. And what we've seen in basically since the 1970s is that in the United States, wages have largely been stagnant, adjusted for inflation, and they haven't not just met inflation, but they also haven't met productivity. This means that there's increasing economic inequality and a frustration that actually comes with that. And this is actually leading to polarization of politics in the US. Another element is changing demographics in the US, where basically the US is on track to being a majority minority country, which means that white people are going to still be the largest group, but they're not going to be the majority anymore, right? And this is leading to some concern about in some groups. This map is actually a good illustration of the extent of polarization. And there's a whole series you can actually look at from 92 to 2016. I only took the sort of two ends of it. And what this basically shows is these are basically counties where the majority went for one candidate versus another. And the gray is where basically the majority didn't go for a single candidate, rather the vote was split. And you can actually see that there is much more polarization over the years. Now, the other factors that played a role, some are not that important, some actually are. So for example, one significant factor was the October surprise, where basically the FBI director announced that he was investigating Hillary's hard drive. This has been questioned, and some people have accused him of trying to sabotage. Other people said that basically what he tried to do is put this information out there because he was worried about leaks, and that would actually look even worse for the election. But this didn't, and this ended up hurting Hillary, and specifically because it fit into the narrative, even though there really wasn't a smoking gun in this, but it did hit the narrative that Hillary was corrupt and she was part of the corruption in Washington. Now, other factors, third parties, they did actually take votes away, but there's no indication that they really actually hurt one candidate over another. The way, for example, Ross Perot hurt Bush Sr. and led to Clinton victory in Bill Clinton victory in 1992. Fake news and Russian interference did play a role, but again, it wasn't as significant, and this has been used by as a scapegoat or an explanation with the Democratic Party of why they ended up losing. Now, the truth is that there is credible evidence that Russia did try to intervene and other elements of sort of fake news, but it's really hard to say how much of an impact that did actually have. So the question is, why didn't we see this coming? And usually the biggest thing that people talk about in the 26 election is the surprise, right? And the truth is we did see it coming, right? The polls were not as far off as a lot of people like to think. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And the real problem was basically mistakes in state polls. National polls were actually quite good. State polls were a little bit off. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But we also have to remember what polls are, right? And, polls are not, they're just basically the best guess, right? And if it says that there's an 80% chance of one candidate winning and a 20% chance of the other candidate losing, that doesn't mean that one candidate is guaranteed, right, to win. It's the same thing as, if you play Russian roulette, put one bullet in the chamber, the chances of surviving are almost 85%, right? But that doesn't mean that you're guaranteed to survive, right? But here's actually the average of final polls leading into the election and the actual results. And we see that actually largely it conforms. There weren't any states that actually ended up being a complete surprise, with the exception of Wisconsin. And the predictions largely held as expected, right? The real difference was, so where polls were off was in state versus national polls. And basically, what ended up happening is in a lot of swing states, and particularly in Pennsylvania, and then Michigan and Wisconsin, the polls looked like they were going to go for Hillary, but they ended up going for Trump. But they ended up going for Trump by very small margins, right? If you actually look at how many votes Trump won by in these places altogether, it's about 110,000 votes, right? So very small numbers. The other thing is that the polls didn't actually take into account education levels. Usually, when you take a sample and you actually take into account demographic factors in order to see, if your sample only has it has less women than the national average, then you'll basically weigh responses by women a little more, and so on. And they did this for most of the usual categories. They didn't do it for education, and this is where the big split happened, right? The second thing is that independents and undecided voters. So independents are basically those who don't identify as a Democrat or a Republican. And in the US system, you actually have to register as a Republican or Democrat or independent. And undecided voters are basically those that haven't made up their mind. And Trump ended up doing well in both of these groups, right? And taken together, this is why Trump won, right? And the other thing we have to keep in mind is that these kinds of polling mistakes are not that unusual. In fact, the Obama-Romney election, the polling was also off. But in this case, it ended up favoring, the mistakes in polling ended up favoring Romney. And Obama ended up winning a relatively easy re-election, despite the fact that going in, it looked like he wasn't going to make it. There's also less dramatic cases in the case of Bush and Kerry in 2004 and Obama and McCain in 2008. But these are not as significant. The real difference and the comparable miss is the 2012 election. So what about this year's election? Well, Trump in many ways should have been a shoo-in. And if this election was held last year, he probably would have won, right? But basically, there's a lot of mistakes. First of all, so this phrase, it's the economy stupid. This is something that was basically used as a campaign strategy and then later as actually a slogan by the Clinton campaign in 1992, Bill Clinton. And it's basically this idea that, and it's also tied in with a broader factor in democratic politics, that usually the party in power, if the economy is doing well, the party in power stays in power. If it's doing badly, it gets voted out of office. And so, given how well the economy was doing, at least for the most affluent and in a lot of the measures, Trump was actually looking really good. He was unpopular, but a lot of people didn't. But what that translated into for a lot of voters is, we don't really like Trump. We don't think he's a good leader or whatever, but he's doing well with the economy, so we'll just stick with that. The other thing is two other factors that happened in 2020. One is the protests over police violence and the outbreak of the pandemic. Now, these actually could have helped Trump in both cases. If Trump had actually taken a conciliatory approach to Black Lives Matter protests and that kind of thing, he could have minimized the negative impact, right? Although these kinds of protests have been kind of a wash, and people's attitudes towards them has largely followed ideological lines, right? And COVID-19 actually was a very big opportunity for Trump, because if he had taken this seriously, And if he'd actually introduced measures to try to control the pandemic, or at least provide rhetoric showing that he was trying to control the pandemic, um, and provided stimulus, then this would have actually been an excellent opportunity for him to basically show himself, because usually in a crisis, that's when you have the sort of rally around the flag effect. And what we've actually seen in Britain, for example, where arguably the COVID response has been bungled, not as badly as in the case of Trump, but still pretty badly. The government's approval ratings have actually been relatively good compared to the US in terms of handling COVID, right? So this is basically the responses. It's broken down in party lines. Republicans tend to be very favorable with how Trump handled COVID. Democrats, very unfavorable. But for Americans, basically more Americans think he did a bad job than think he did a good job, right? And also, we shouldn't forget that recently, New Zealand, the Labour government there, going into 2020, was actually having relatively weak polling. They were polling at about, I think, like in the 40s. But as a result of the very incredibly successful pandemic response, what ended up happening is that the Labour Party ended up winning a majority government, something that New Zealand hasn't had since the introduction of proportional representation about 30 years ago. So, what were Trump's missteps? First of all, the most important thing is the only stimulus that was provided was back in March. There has been some help to large corporations, tax breaks, and that kind of thing. But for average Americans, very little support. Basically, there was a one-time $1,200 check that was given, which was basically inadequate, and no follow-ups. And in many ways, both Republicans and Democrats have dropped the ball on this, but Trump could have definitely done more to actually get something done here. Second, Trump was very good at attacking Hillary Clinton and basically building on the kind of prejudice people had about Hillary Clinton going into the election. And he was very effective at actually chipping away at that and getting not so much Democratic voters, but independents and undecideds on his side, right? This time around, he's been much less successful. He's basically tried to argue that, Biden is part of the radical left, Kamala Harris is a Marxist and so on. And this really hasn't been landing, right? And Biden has clearly demonstrated that he's actually not a socialist, and so on. So this hit didn't really land. The second thing is the Hunter Biden email scandals. And this was actually supposed to be their, Hillary's email moment, but it ended up being not much of an issue. And it's basically something that news sources have actually cared more about than the average person. And really, it ended up being a non-scandal, right? The idea that Biden had, there's corruption in Washington. Well, that was basically, well known. And a lot of the more personal things ended up backfiring because for a lot of people, they felt that, this wasn't really a fair line of attack, right? So currently, this is what the polls look like, right? And Biden is leading, has a very comfortable national lead, right? And if we compare this to the situation in 2016, so basically it's a little complicated because this graph also includes the Green Party under Stein and the Libertarians under Johnson. But what you'll actually notice is that the gap between Hillary and Trump was not as large. Now, the scale here is a little different, so it's harder to compare. But what you can actually see in the 2020 polls is that Biden has consistently polled better. And there haven't been the points of overlap that we've seen with Hillary, right? So this is an indication that the polls are probably more accurate than they were last time. So this brings us to why we shouldn't dismiss the polls. A lot of people, and especially, for example, Michael Moore, he is convinced that the polls are off again and that Trump is going to win. But there's reason to be much more confident with the polls this time. First of all, polls have done a better job of looking at the state level, especially in battleground states, rather than just the national level. Most polls have started accounting for education as well, so this shouldn't be as much of a surprise. Also, the role of independents, undecided, and third parties are very different. So, first of all, independents have largely seem to have decided already, and they've shifted from Trump to Biden. Undecided voters are a much smaller group this year than they were last year, and that means that there should be less of a surprise. So there's less of a chance for them to swing, and third parties don't play as much of a role, right? In fact, while both Jill Stein and Gary Johnson were more in the news, we haven't seen the same kind of coverage or these kinds of impacts this time, right? Another element is early voting. So the US has actually broken records in terms of early voting, partially because of fears about the chaos that might happen during Election Day. And traditionally, early voting means that it tends to favor Republicans, but this time more Democrats have engaged in early voting. And this also means that more Democrats have locked in their vote, which usually isn't the case. And so that basically means that a larger portion of the polls, as we've seen them coming in, are probably reflected in the vote, as we'll see it next week. But here's an exercise. This is actually from the New York Times, and what they did is they actually looked at what the current polls are. So this is the in the first categories, there's the U.S. and then key states, which are either battleground states or potential battleground states. And so these are the polls. Biden is up in most of them. Trump still has a very narrow margin in Ohio and a margin in Texas as well. But these are the two columns are basically looking at what if the polls are as off this year as they were in the two previous cases, 2016 and 2012. So in the case of 2016, Biden is still ahead in most states. And if we have a situation like 2020, Biden is actually going to do much better. So there even is a theoretical possibility of Texas flipping to Democrats. It's probably not the most likely, but it is possible. And this graph here shows the breakdown in electoral votes. So basically, these are the votes that seem right now a sure thing. So basically, places where the candidate leads by more than 3 points, right? If we just go by that, Biden wins even if Trump gets all the rest. Now, if the polls are as predicted, then Biden is going to have a very clear landslide in terms of the electoral votes. And even if the polls are as wrong as in 2016, Biden is still expected to win, right? So this indicates that while, of course, it's still not a sure thing, the polls really do indicate, and there's good reason to believe that Biden is actually going to win. Now, does that guarantee it? No. And there's a couple of things that actually might throw a spanner in the works, right? But anyway, right now, what it looks like is Biden is going to win the presidency. The Democrats are going to hold on to the House, and they might get a bare majority or even a 50-50 split in the Senate. But with Kamala Harris as vice president, they could actually have 51-50, right? That still doesn't mean that Biden is going to have an easy presidency. There's going to face a lot of opposition in the Senate, but this is the most likely outcome. Now, there are a couple of complications that might actually invalidate this, right? First of all is the effect of the pandemic. Second of all, the role of legal challenges. And finally, violence, right? So in terms of, running an election in a plague year, right? This can affect voter turnout. And in fact, tied into this is efforts in various US states to actually try to control turnout. Probably one of the worst examples is in Texas, basically passed a law that you only have one polling station in every county, which means that some rural counties are going to have this, will have, with only a few hundred people, are going to have as many polling places as counties that have up to 4 million people, right? Absentee and mail-in ballots are going to increase. And this can be a problem because of how long it could take to actually count these. And the legal challenges are going to be made in terms of which votes to count, as well as how long are you able to count them, right? And it actually has varied. Some states, you'll only be able to count it if the mail-in ballot is received the day of the election, or some will have counting a few more days after that. And this is why a lot of Democrats in particular are basically avoiding the mail and handing in their mailing ballots in person, which you can still sort of do. You can drop it off. But there's also an important effect that actually hurts Trump here, right? And as I said before, Trump's biggest support came from uneducated working class whites and elderly whites. And of course, the pandemic has disproportionately hit the elderly, right? And this has actually hurt Trump. And in fact, the largest shift we're likely going to see is a shift basically in the suburbs and among older Americans as they abandon Trump and go for Biden, right? Now, of course, this doesn't mean that Biden will have it all his own way. There are indications that Biden might not do that well with the Latino vote. Similarly, while older African Americans are eager to vote for Biden, younger African Americans are not. A lot of them are very disillusioned, and many of them don't actually plan on voting, especially since they see that Biden will not fix a lot of the problems that they are concerned with. Right? Now, in terms of legal challenges, and this is where we might have a situation like in 2000, where the election is not decided by the millions of voters, but by 9, in essence, electors, the Supreme Court, right? And this is in fact what happened in Bush v. Gore in 2000. Most indications is that Bush would have won Florida, but basically recounts were being made. The Supreme Court of Florida allowed the recounts to continue, but this was challenged. And eventually went to the Supreme Court, where it was eventually decided to stop counting. And this was basically, in essence, orchestrated by, so at the time, Jeb Bush was governor of Florida, and a lot of the people who are even in the Trump administration were actually tied in with those actions. What we're going to see is a lot of legal challenges. They're already happening, and this has been an unusual year because the Supreme Court has already listened to a number of challenges and made rulings in these cases. And of course, Trump is favored in the Supreme Court, right? Not only right now with Amy Coney Barrett are there more conservative justices than liberal justices. The other aspect here is that, interestingly enough, Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh were actually, I'm not actually, I should double check about Coney Barrett, but I know Kavanaugh was actually involved on the Republican side of arguing in the case Bush v. Gore, right? And so challenges are like, any legal challenges are probably going to go Trump's way. However, this isn't guaranteed, right? Even though the judges might have bias, they also want to basically seem as objective as possible, right? Now, what about violence, right? And interestingly enough, you might have seen that there was an article today or came out that basically Walmart has decided to pull guns and ammunition from their stores in fear of potential violence. Now, there actually is a long history in the US and actually in most democracies of violence and being involved in the democratic process, right? You can think of the Civil War, but other cases as well, and there have been historical examples of elections that have been affected by violence or violence being used to try to achieve a political agenda. So, for example, the Bleeding Kansas years, when basically free staters who wanted to basically see Kansas enter as a free state, and those who wanted to see Kansas enter as a slave state, both went into the state, and this led to violence. In fact, this is where John Brown got politicized, and that's right now. There's actually the I can't believe if it's. I don't know if it's HBO or Showtime, but Good Lord Bird, basically a miniseries on John Brown and actually Bleeding Kansas. Now, two things I want to point out is that violence is likely going to be minimal. In terms of violence is very possible, and I also think that violence is likely going to favor the right and Republicans rather than the left, and I'll discuss that in a moment. But some people have talked about the possibility of a second civil war, prolonged violence, and I think this is very unlikely. The reason is because while we tend to think of violence very often as basically being almost this spontaneous outpouring of anger and resentment, and sometimes it can happen that way, but this kind of violence tends not to be very prolonged, right? For violence in a society to turn into more sustained violence or a civil war really requires organization, right? And we don't see this in the US. We do see that there are a number of right-wing militias, and they pose a possible threat, but there aren't the equivalent left-wing militias. So it would be a lopsided conflict. Secondly, most police services and most importantly, the army is unlikely, especially the army is unlikely to basically intervene on either side, even though basically both the police and the military tend to be skew more Republican. The U.S. doesn't have a history of the army getting involved in politics, and that's very important. So why did I say that I think violence favors the right? Well, here's some measures of basically terrorism in the US since 9/11, right? And the numbers here is total deaths, and the numbers down here are number of incidents, right? And the light blue are right-wing extremists, and the dark blue are Islamic extremists. And you can see that in terms of number of incidents and also in terms of death toll, in most years, with the exception of 2016, 2015, 2019, and 2002, right-wing violence has been equal or greater than Islamic terrorism, right? And this is just another breakdown of those kinds of those numbers. And basically, right-wing's attacks are more common than Islamic attacks. Islamic attacks tend to be a little more violent, but the numbers basically are still close. And these are actually just measures of comparing left-wing Islamic and right-wing violence. These are two different scales. There are two different sources, but they basically sort of follow these numbers, right? In that left-wing and Islamic violence is less common than right-wing violence, and in terms of right-wing violence, more of it gets Islamic violence tends to be foiled more often because of what people are paying attention. Right-wing less so. Now, of course, I want to emphasize that I'm not saying here that the right is inherently more violent than the left, but these are the recent circumstances. Another element here is that basically over the years, the number of patriot groups or right-wing militias has been increasing. They basically started in the Clinton years, kind of decreased under the Bush years, and have increased during the Obama years and have sort of continued, right? So the most likely scenario is that if violence happens, for example, a scenario, Portland is a city that is a very liberal city surrounded by very conservative areas. And in the past, what we've seen in terms of violence is right-wing groups go in, they clash with the left, and the police tend to take the right side. And so that might be the kind of violence we see, where we have violent clashes in these kinds of battleground cities, and the police is most likely going to come down on left-wing protesters, right? In fact, this is largely what we've seen during the protests, right, where there has been violence on both sides, but very often there's been a lot of violence by police and right-wing groups. So, what is the likely outcome? I know I'm very close, but I'm close to time, but I'll just basically finish up quickly. So, the real danger here is what Trump does if he loses or if it's close. Now, the US has not been a perfect democracy over its history, has problems with gerrymandering, other forms of voter suppression. This has happened on both the left and the right, and this is also not uncommon in other democracies. But one of the key measures of democracy is what's known as the democratic moment, which is when you lose an election, you basically leave office. Trump has basically threatened that he might not. And this could be very dangerous, right? In essence, this is how Bush won. Basically, Gore decided that for the purposes of maintaining democracy and not stoking conflict, that he would step down, even though he had good reason to think that Bush, that he could have won. The last time this happened was when there was a disputed election between Hayes and Tilden in 1876, and this was solved by the Compromise of 77, where basically Tilden, who was a Democrat, was convinced to give the election to Hayes. In return, Hayes would promise to take soldiers out of the South and basically end Reconstruction. And so the US doesn't really have a way of dealing with this, right? I actually think that Trump would probably not be successful in this, but it is still a possibility. Anyway, I think I'm going to end it there and see if there's any questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Ivan, for all of that. I'll monitor the chat here and also the Facebook page for any questions. I don't see any yet, so maybe I will ask something. I think you were just touching on this right at the end, but I think I've read before that when there has been a question over the result of the election, eventually there was some, as you said, like eventually there was some factor that made it resolvable. So Gore decided like, okay, I'm just going to let this go. What does it look like if things are more up in the air, or because of misinformation or the way that people feel, like the public just isn't convinced in general either way who has won the election? Does that lead to any lasting problems, or how do you see that resolving ultimately?
Well, that's actually, it's tricky to predict, but and actually there's a number of ways this could be questioned, right? So a lot of people say that if there isn't a Biden landslide, people are going to question the results. But even if there is a Biden landslide, people might actually question this, especially if the landslide happens a few days after the polls are closed. And that'll, the line will be the deep state is intervening and stealing your election. Now, Republicans will take, I think, advantage of this and try to use as many legal challenges as possible. But in the long run, this could actually, it could hurt them if they actually try to push this through, right? Now, in terms of, violence, what about, unrest and that kind of thing? Here, I think that that actually might trigger violence and protests and that kind of thing. But there's also an element where, in sort of trying to cover all this, it might have come off that I'm exaggerating the extent of the possibility of violence. I still think that the violence will be low level and it won't impact the election more generally. Because, so interestingly enough, one news story I didn't talk about is how there were members of a right-wing militia who were trying to kidnap the governor of Michigan. And they were actually stopped in part because the FBI had witnesses on the inside who were basically getting worried about what some members of the militia were doing, right? So there's still a lot of Americans who basically wouldn't want violence and wouldn't even want something unusual. There are, of course, now we've already seen that basically, Republicans have, you know, when Obama was in power, they said you can't appoint a Supreme Court judge, 9 months before the election. That's whatever. And then, of course, a couple 2 months before the election, they put in their own. So they're going to fight. I think the Democrats are not going to be as willing to concede. So then it goes to the Supreme Court. But I think that what actually might happen is that Trump might also use this sort of confusion in the Republican Congress to try to pass as many executive orders and bills to make it hard for Biden when he comes to power. So, and that's why it's just unpredictable. I actually, there might be some kind of political compromise, but I don't. It would actually be a big step for them to cross the line and try to reverse the election, right?
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Pam had a question. You can see it there in the chat. But basically, what about the mail-in ballot issue? Is Trump trying to derail the Postal Service, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I mean, Trump has already derailed the Postal Service. And the truth is, the Republicans have been trying to dismantle the mail service for a long time now. But the thing is that people have known about this for a long time, and this is why we've had so much early voting and basically people trying to get their ballots in early. So all the efforts that have been made will actually have an impact, but people have taken this into account. So it's hard to say what the ultimate outcome will be.
Jenna is asking, where does the information ultimately come from for the polls?
Okay, so basically the polls that I showed you, and most polls you're going to see are basically polls of polls, right? And so basically people take various polls, they know their methodology, and then they put them together. And that actually ends up producing better results because in essence, you're increasing your sample size, right? So that's where the polls come from. Another reason I didn't touch on is this idea that what can happen with polls and what a lot of people believe happened last time is that you ask, who are you going to vote for, Trump or Hillary? And they say Hillary, but they want to vote Trump, right? Now, this can play a role, but it wasn't, I think, as big of a role as a lot of people like to make it out to be. So this idea that that people are lying in polls is possible, but probably not as serious. So.
I'll ask another question. I don't see any others right now. If any of you who are joining us on Facebook, you can just put a comment there and I'll communicate it to Ivan. Jen has one. Let's see. We'll go with that one first, so it's not me asking another question. What types of legal challenges do you see being used to challenge the results? And will one party be using more legal challenges than the other?
So the most likely legal challenges are going to be about the mail-in ballots. And so there might be a case where ballots are closed and recounts might happen. This is what happened during the last election. Right now, the more likely challenge is going to be in terms of which ballots are going to be voted. And there also might be challenges in terms of, because the problem with mail-in ballots, states have their own rules and they vary from state to state, and so there might be a lot of challenged ballots, and there'd be a question about, okay, do we count these votes or no? If somebody put in a signature but it doesn't fully match, that kind of thing. So those are the likely challenges. The way things stand now, most of the challenges are going to be from Republicans, but that's partially because they're probably going to see the votes are probably going to go against them, so they're going to challenge. Most of the Democratic challenges have already taken place. In some cases, they've been successful. In others, they haven't, right?
My other question, I think you touched on this very briefly. Are you mostly focused on post-election violence, What
Yeah.
about, I feel like I read about in this election, I don't know whether it's just due to the tensions or due to the pandemic or due to some other factor, but I think I read that there might be more like voter intimidation
Mhm.
going on. So, for example, and again, I don't quite know how the American system works, but I feel like the different polls are run by the different parties or something. But somehow there's a possibility for like right wing militias to kind of show up to polls and just be holding their guns
Yeah,
and try to keep people.
yeah, and it is actually possible that you might have both sides doing that. So right wing militias on one side, left wing militias on the other. Even though they're fewer, there are things like new Black Panthers and that kind of thing. Yeah, but I do want to add that there have already been cases. So there was a case in New York where a police officer, off-duty police officer, parked his police cruiser and used the megaphone to basically chant Trump 2020. There have been cases of basically off-duty police officers going to intimidate, and I mean, one of the worst cases when what's his name? Oh, when Giuliani won the election in New York for mayor, he actually had off-duty cops go in as poll monitors at polling districts, and especially in low-income districts. So that's possible. It likely won't. So we will see intimidation, but we probably won't see that. Hopefully, escalating into violence. So,
There's another question from Jen here. I'm sure you can see it, but
mm.
back onto the legal challenges. How successful do you think the challenges might be? And would there be perhaps a widespread discounting or rejecting of Democrat votes?
I actually, that's hard to say because it depends on what the challenges end up materializing around. Uh, my guess is that we're most likely to see the kind of outcome that we saw under Bush v. Gore, where it's a very narrow margin, and the Supreme Court, puts its fingers on the scale and basically, instead of flipping a coin or letting parcel out all the votes, just basically uh, coming in somebody else's side. Something more dramatic is going to be, I think, less likely. That I don't think that the Supreme Court would want to set the precedent where it, swings the election very wildly, right? So that's why I think that the more votes that Biden gets, the less likely that the challenges will be successful.
I guess I won't ask another question after this one because even though I probably could fill the time with my own questions, I don't know if that's always a good use of time. But I do want to ask, what do you think the overall effects will be on, let's say, voter apathy? So, I mean, what have the effects been this election? Obviously, people might be a little less likely to vote because of the pandemic, but I feel like the tensions are really high, which might drive people to vote. But what about
Yeah.
after? I mean, what if there is a big question about who wins and it ends up being a Supreme Court challenge? Does that I feel like that would make me lose a little bit of faith in the process, and I'd be like, "Well, I don't even know why. Why would I vote?" Do you think
Yeah.
that's likely to happen? Did it happen in the past during those same questions?
I mean, I think that in some ways it's already been happening, right? In that, so most democracies have problems with voter turnout. This is the case in the US. Voter turnout is going to be higher, most likely, and we've already broken early voter records. There is a large number of voters in the US, especially working class voters who don't vote. And very often they're assumed to be ignorant, they don't follow politics, but a lot of them basically just are disenchanted with the system. And the factors that I've already mentioned how so Latino voters are not as keen on Biden, for example, as they were for Bernie Sanders. And there's sort of a little bit of potential resentment there. There's also the fact that, for example, I mentioned that young black voters, a lot of them don't feel like they should vote because they don't. So, for example, on an issue like police violence, we have not exactly similar, but Biden seems to be more on the police are fine. We should increase funding and do some more training, and that'll fix things, which for a lot of people is just not. So the U.S. already has this problem, and this is one of the problems that the U.S. is politically very polarized. The U.S. watches politics very often, and especially for some groups. direct action is being seen as more valuable than voting. So um, this is very possible, and actually, both parties need to do a better job of actually meeting voter expectations. There's been a number of studies of U.S. politics that indicate that public opinion has very little impact on policy decisions, right? And very often it's lobbyists do have more influence, and so there is this feeling of a democratic deficit. In essence, this is one of the things that helped Trump the first time, and isn't really helping him now, right?
So Jen has another question. I think we'll target that to be our last question, but I suppose if there's
Okay.
another, we can always consider. I'm glad she asked this one because I was thinking this too, and if she doesn't mind, I'm going to add a tiny bit to it. But I think especially given the dispute or the tension over this idea of Supreme Court nominees and sort of the Republicans saying, no, that's not okay. And then when it was their turn to make the decision, like, yes, it is okay. Do you think
Yeah.
there's going to be an increased tendency for the Democrats to also sort of stop playing fair and sort of do all of these things that will give them the political advantages if they control all three houses?
Uh, I actually don't think so. I mean, they are going to try to push a lot of things through, but what we've seen, and Biden very much has been, he isn't very ideological. He does seem to basically want to bring in a public option for Obamacare as his sort of legacy, but he doesn't seem to want very radical changes, and he prides himself on his ability to be bipartisan. The other thing is that one thing that's left over is that there is going to be a conflict between the more progressive versus the more centrist wing of the Democratic Party. And what we've seen is that Biden and the centrists have been more keen on getting Republicans on their side than getting the progressive Democrats. And what we're probably going to see is that we're going to see more Republicans in Biden's administration. And I think that the strategy that the Democrats are going to, especially if they win by a landslide, is that okay, we don't need the radical left wing. We actually can actually take over the middle class and suburban voters from Republicans. I don't think that's a long term strategy, but in order to gain that, they're probably not going to be as likely to challenge. There might be. It depends on how far the conflicts go, but this is my guess. Given the situation right now.
Great. There is one last question from Facebook Live. It's from a student, so I want to communicate it, even though I'm going to have to leave right away. So I'm going to have to leave. I'll give you the question, and I'm going to have to leave and let Jen do the conclusion.
Okay.
But the question is about who funds the polls. So are polls funded by the actual political parties? And if they are, is it possible to increase the legitimacy of those polls by having some sort of independent agency?
Actually, polls are conducted by a number of groups. There are polling agencies. Both parties actually run their own polls, and in fact, Trump's own polls back, even back in over the summer, showed that he wasn't doing well. There's a number of universities that conduct polls. Some of them are considered very reliable, like the Monmouth College poll, and so on. So um, the polls end up being better than a lot of people assume. And of course, there's always room for improvement. And the good thing is there is sort of a diversity of polls. News agencies like CNN and Fox News also conduct polls. And so when you're looking at all these polls, you're looking at everybody's poll outcomes. Now, of course, CNN polls tend to favor Biden more. Fox News polls tend to favor Trump more. But on the whole, especially when you're looking poll of polls, it's we have a clear picture coming up, right?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ivan, for this. This is an amazing presentation. I could talk to you all day about this stuff. That's why I had so many questions. But yeah, no, really, thank you so much. And the presentation is recorded, so it will be available afterwards if anyone wants to see it. And yeah, thanks everybody for joining us today.
Yeah. Thank you all. Bye.